either shaving off 15 minutes from the lunch schedule or shaving off time from the break so that we can further discuss the October agenda. And so if any task force members have any strong opinions as to whether we should shave off time and where, whether it's the lunch period or the break period, feel free to make those comments known now.
I prefer the break.
Yes, I
Same.
too would waive the break as well. Sprat.
Okay, great.
Either.
Okay. Oh, either. Okay. So we will waive the break and we'll resume after lunch at 2 o'clock. So our lunch will remain an hour. So thank you all, and I will see you all at 2. Task force members, please come back to your devices 10 minutes before 2. Thank you.
Yes. We're going to touch that out of here.
Good afternoon, task force members and members of the public. It is 2:00, and we will now resume with the public hearing. I will turn it to Parliamentarian Johnson, who will then turn to Ms. Belton, so that a roll call vote can be established.
Thank you. Attorney Belton, would you please call the roll and report on the quorum?
Thank you, Chair Moore and Parliamentarian Johnson. I will go in order and ask that the task force members indicate their presence. Chair Moore.
Present.
Vice Chair Dr. Brown. Senator Stephen Bradford. Dr. Cheryl Grills. Lisa Holder.
Here.
Assemblymember Reginald Jones Sawyer. Dr. Javon Stott Lewis.
Here. Jones Sawyer here.
Thank you, Assemblymember Jones Sawyer. Dr. Cheryl Grills.
Here.
Don Tamaki.
Here.
Councilmember Monica Montgomery Stepp.
I'm sorry, here.
Senator Stephen Bradford. Vice Chair Dr. Brown. Madam Chair, there are 9 task force members and the number needed for a quorum is 5. There are 7 task force members currently present. A quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you, Ms. Belton. We will now turn to our next agenda item number 16. It's our second panel for the day. I'm in the 4th panel for the hearing. Yes, point of order.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Parliamentarian Johnson, you are recognized.
You're exactly where you are. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Chair Moore, I had asked before the break if I could get my questions in from this morning's panel. Is that still possible?
Yes, you are recognized, Member Grills.
Thank you. Unfortunately, when I lost power, my 8 or 9 pages of notes from this morning's testimony was not being auto-saved. So to the best that my memory is serving me, these are my questions. First, this would be for Professor Hudson and Ms. Wilkerson and any of the panelists. California had over 200 or 100, I'm not sure the exact number, sundown towns. How might they be investigated since even with subpoena power, many of the practices were not codified, but they are in fact part of the memory and oral history of people with longstanding residence in those communities? The second question was for Professor Parman. Given your statements regarding the length of time to reach equity and the limitations of single strategies like housing, because of the multitude of other policies and practices that might shortchange gains from that approach, might it be important to consider employing something similar to what is used in environmental policy, where they require environmental impact studies to receive adoption of public policies or to examine potential disproportionate impact of existing policies? Third, for Ms. Gorman, you raised in your opening the harm done to your family, including PTSD, which was important for me to hear because we have yet as a task force to consider the historical and ongoing psychological and physiological damage from enslavement and all the post-enslavement maneuvers used to subjugate and control Black life. Might you share ways in which PTSD manifests itself in your family and or community? And then the final question is for Ms. Wilkerson and the other panelists. Next to none of your work would see the light of day in our local and national public education systems. In fact, this country has made a practice of denying the truth and creating a mythical narrative of the history of the United States. And we also see the backlash against any kind of truth and reconciliation in the controversy related to critical race theory and other such acts. So given states' rights and the perceived limited reach of federal authority with respect to education content and practice, how can truth be systematically introduced into our local and national education practice? Are there things California can do to lead the way on this front? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member Grills, for those questions. Now we will move to agenda item 16, witness panel number 4, which will run between now and 3:30 p.m. I would like to remind each witness that their testimony is recorded, live streamed, and will be available to the public. The first person that we will hear from is John A. Powell. Professor Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. And Professor Powell will have 20 minutes to speak. The next expert that we will hear from is Secretary of State Shirley Weber. Secretary of State Weber is California's first Black American Secretary of State. Before her appointment as Secretary of State, Secretary Weber served 4 terms as an Assembly member representing California's 79th Assembly District. Secretary Weber is retired from the Department of Africana Studies at California State University at Los Angeles after 40 years as a faculty member and serving several terms as department chair. And last but not least, we will hear from Dawn Bassiano, who will have 10 minutes to speak. Ms. Bassiano is a mother, a grandmother, and the family historian. She is a resident of Sacramento. Her 3rd great-grandfather was enslaved, and his father was his enslaver. And then we will have 30 minutes for the task force to pose any comments or questions to those providing expert and personal testimony for us today on this particular panel. So without further ado, I would like to thank those who are providing expert testimony for this panel today, and then recognize Professor Powell. You may start your expert testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is Professor John Powell. It's great to see some of you and to be a part of this really important process. I want to start by just contextualizing some of my remarks. I'm going to be talking primarily about civic engagement and voting throughout the country with some reference to California. I'm aware that some people might think that civic engagement in general and voting in particular, how is that related to enslavement? Is that a long drift away from the focus of enslavement and reparation? So first I want to just speak to that. So the 13th Amendment, as everyone knows, is what largely ended, not entirely, but largely ended slavery in the United States. There's a provision in there that allows for involuntary servitude if someone's duly convicted of a crime, which amounts to saying those people can still be enslaved. And there's a history of enslavement for people convicted of a crime up until 1945. So even though we think of this as something that happened a long time ago, there's some indication that extreme forms of enslavement happened until 1945, and some may be going on even today under the 13th Amendment. But having said that, 13th Amendment is the primary constitutional provision that changes the breadth of enslavement in the United States. And one of the things that's important in terms of the 13th Amendment for this hearing, how far does the reach of enslavement go, and how far does the reach of ending enslavement go? And what would develop very quickly, even before the passing of the 13th Amendment, was the idea of the incidence and badge of slavery. So it wasn't just formal slavery. The country, both in terms of popular discourse and legal discourse, recognized that there were some things that were incidence and badge of enslavement. Now, the exact meaning of those terms have mutated and continue to mutate. And probably one of our best sources in terms of legal discourse is Justice Harlan, who's sometimes called the Great Dissenter. And under Justice Harlan's jurisprudence, it's fairly clear that many of the issues that we're dealing with today, that he was dealing with at that time, from a jury selection, from a public accommodation, from segregation, and including voting, was considered a badge and incidence of slavery. So one could argue, so why are Blacks not oftentimes given public accommodation during Justice Harlan time? And Justice Harlan said that in of itself is a badge and incidence of slavery. So what I want to posit is that many of our voting laws themselves are also a badge and incidence of slavery. So it's not far removed. It's actually just an extension of the way we continue as a country to deny people their citizenship rights, the human rights, and to dismantle the badge and incidence of slavery. So let me go now to the 15th Amendment, which is passed in 1870. And after Congress passed the 13th and 14th Amendment, they found that Blacks still were being greatly intimidated and were not being given the right to vote. And they passed the 15th Amendment, which guarantees the right to vote and basically says someone should not be denied the right to vote based on previous servitude. So the 15th Amendment then is the constitutional amendment that enshrines voting, if you will, to actually remove the badge and incidence of slavery. When we look at voting, we find that, first of all, that passage, even though it was passed in 1870, very little was done on a systematic level to actually make sure that Blacks could vote almost up until the 1960s. So we lost 90, almost 100 years in terms of enforcing the 15th Amendment. Now, that's important because a lot of people will think, well, these things happened a long time ago. Why are we still talking about it? The very scope and purpose of these amendments did not really go into effect until fairly recently. In fact, I would say they didn't start taking real effect until 1965, the passing of the Voting Rights Act. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So I'm talking mainly about what's happening nationally, but I also want to bring California into this. So California, when it became a state, one of the things it put in its constitution, it limited voting only to white males. So again, even though it was a free state, it expressly denied the right to vote to Blacks. And when the 15th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1870, only two free states opposed the amendment and initially did not ratify. One was Oregon and the other was California. So even though California was a free state, it was not a state that was hospitable to Blacks. And that continued. There were a number of things California did. One of the speakers already mentioned that there were a number of sundown towns in California. And so there was not necessarily a sharp division between a slave state and a free state. Some people assume that if you have a free state, you are hospitable to Blacks, and that's not the case. California was not hospitable to Blacks, and especially in the context of voting, as well as other provisions. Now, in fairness to California, that started to change around World War II, and in more recent times, California has been considered a more inclusive state in terms of voting and other provisions. That's not true of the country, though. The country has largely remained hostile to Blacks in terms of recognizing full citizenship and dismantling the badge and incidence of slavery. And I want to talk about some of those. Voting itself is key to being a full member of a democracy. I've written articles on that, and I'd gladly make it available to the commission. But in democracy, you can't be a full citizen, and you can't unless you can participate and vote. That's the primary good. All the other goods, from housing, education, to health, to jobs, flow from that. If that's not present, all those other things are on shaky grounds or denied as well. And that's one of the reasons that there have been so many fights over the issue of voting. So after the passing of the 15th Amendment, voting for blacks stayed almost close to zero until the 1960s. So blacks were not participating and were still living under a deep cloud of badge and incidence of slavery. On a personal note, probably like many of you, my family was from the South. They were sharecroppers. They did not participate in the formal economy, and they did not enjoy many of the things that we would have considered as an incidence of being a full citizen. They moved to Detroit in the 1940s as part of the Great Migration, and eventually achieved some of those rights, but not without a great deal of fight. So I want to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I want to talk about that both as a historical event, some of its problems with it today, as interpreted by the court, but also to suggest some of the things the committee might consider. So the Voting Rights of 1965 was radical in many ways. It was designed to implement the 15th Amendment. It was designed to operationalize the 15th Amendment. Now, the states had adopted a number of mechanisms to actually prohibit blacks from voting, whether it was private and public acts. But the list is too long to even chronicle at this time. But there were things like the grandfather clause. That is, you couldn't vote unless your grandfather voted. Well, if your family had been enslaved, your grandfather didn't vote. Actually, ironically, maybe your grandfather did vote because maybe your grandfather was white. But in most cases, the grandfather didn't vote. So there was the grandfather clause. There was the poll tax. Now think about this. In many parts of the South, it was illegal to educate blacks. And yet there was a poll tax taxing them. There's also the literacy test, a test given to people before they could vote. Again, if you're not educated, can't read, or don't know your history, you're not going to pass the literacy test. There were white primaries, and the list goes on. And one of the things that the Congress and the court found is that whenever they went after any one of these things, the purveyors would actually just adopt something else. It was like a whack-a-mole. You knock one thing down and something else pops up over here. And they felt they could never get ahead of it, that the states kept passing laws to prevent blacks from voting, no matter what Congress did. And so that changed in 1965. And one way it changed in 1965 was something called Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which required certain states, and then later extended to municipalities as well, to not change the law without getting pre-clearance if the law is going to have a negative effect on the outcome of black voting. I'm going to just restate that again. So the law was, you as a state or municipality can't change your law without getting a pre-clearance from either the Attorney General or a federal court showing that your law will not have a negative effect on black voting. That the burden was on the state or the municipality that wanted to actually change their law. And so you couldn't change it without getting a pre-clearance. Now, that law was struck down largely by the Supreme Court in 2013 under Shelby County versus Holder. So pre-clearance is no longer the law of the land. And what we see is a plethora of new laws and passed all around the country prohibiting, limiting, suppressing the black vote. Now, that's just a more direct way of doing it. There's also a number of indirect ways of doing it. And I'll just mention a couple. There's something called gerrymandering, which is to draw districts in such a way that blacks can vote, but their vote does not count. You do not have essentially one person, one vote. Again, Supreme Court, under a very conservative Supreme Court, has accepted the legality of gerrymandering, which is another way of actually limiting the black vote. Another is requiring certain types of government ID. Again, just in 2020, there have been over 400 legislations introduced to limit voting, over 400 just in 2020. And this is under the backdrop of every commission that looked at it found that there was no voter fraud. There was no reason for this plethora of new laws being passed, except what's happened is the Supreme Court has weakened the Voting Rights Act and basically said to states, if you want to limit people's right to vote, particularly blacks and other people of color, we won't stop you. And they have been off to the races doing this across the country. And so we're seeing the hard-won fights over that 100-year period from the passing of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment, try to remove the badge and incidence of slavery. That wall has been removed, and we're seeing new efforts. I sort of sometimes only half-jokingly say, we're still fighting the Civil War, and the South is winning. And so I think civic participation is key. And I've only have a few minutes left, and I'll just say, while I talk a lot about voting, we can also look at things like jury duty. We can look at other ways which people participate, both to express their citizenship, but also to protect their communities. And this is one place where California has not done so well. Black participation in juries has been abysmal. And there's one study done, I think at UC Berkeley, which looked at something called peremptory challenges, which is what a prosecutor has, not prosecutor, both parties have, in terms of striking a jury. And in one study, I think over 70% of the juries struck were African American. African Americans were removed from the jury, and less than 1% of whites were removed from a jury. Now, peremptory challenge is something that a lawyer can use in a courtroom without giving any reason. All they have to say is, I don't want that juror. And what's happening in practice is a systematic exclusion of blacks from juries, largely by prosecutors. And you start off with blacks being underrepresented in the jury pool, and then those who are in the jury pool also being excluded. The last thing I'll mention, as my time runs out, is going back to voting. Again, is historically, what we've done in the country is that we've associated committing a crime with voting. And so these examples are most extreme in the South, but they're actually prevalent everywhere. And until very recently, it was also very prevalent here. And that is, even after someone has served their time committing a crime, there's some states that do not restore the right to vote. And there are literally millions, with a disproportionate number of them being black, people who are, again, not able to exercise basic rights as citizens to vote, even after they've served their time. California recently changed that law, I think in 2020, to make it easier for someone to vote after they serve their time. So I'll end by just saying California is trending in the right direction on most things. Jury thing is pretty weak still. It's some of the stuff on felonies, but voting is relatively accessible in California. Blacks vote at about the same rate as whites, a little less, but close to the same rates as whites. But this long tail of trying to roll back the backlash in the country is quite pernicious and has had a negative effect on both the Black community and our very democracy. And I think any serious effort to look at reparation has to look at people's right, not just what happened prior to 1865, but what's happening now, the bads and incidents of slavery that continue to be systematically implemented throughout our society. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Powell, for that thorough presentation. I would like to now turn it to Secretary of State Shirley Weber for her expert testimony. Welcome, Secretary of State, and you may begin your testimony when you're ready. Thank you. Secretary of State Weber had to step out. We can turn to Dawn Bassiano for her personal testimony and then return to Secretary Weber. Dawn Bassiano, if you're ready, you can present your personal testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for the work that you guys are doing. I'm hoping that you can save space to interview other families as well and hear their stories. I almost didn't come to testify today. Documenting and reliving my family's trauma is extremely overwhelming, but I'm here. What initially prompted me to document my family was learning that my fourth great grandfather, John Binion, enslaved and in the loosest of context, fathered my third great grandfather, Simon Binion. I've been working on my family's genealogy for 2 decades and have many, many stories to share, but 2 that I want to share with you today I think would resonate. My great-grandmother, Evelyn, married my great-grandfather, Anias Binion, in 1906. In 1928, he was hanged, and my great-grandparents' home was torched, killing their youngest child. No time to grieve nor bury her husband and child, my grandmother fled Georgia and headed to California, landing in Sacramento in 1929. It's important that you know she held the pain of losing her husband and child her entire life. Bottling up her grief made her distant, and her aversion and fear of white America I now understand. She mourned in her own way, but never truly healed. And in 1929, she married Pearlie Monroe in Sacramento, California. Pearlie's grandparents, Nancy and Peter Gooch, were enslaved in California, brought to Coloma in 1849, freed when California entered the Union as a free state in 1850. When Nancy was taken to California, she was forced to leave her only child and son, Andrew, behind in Missouri, sold to the Monroe family. In 1870, Andrew, his wife, and 2 sons, one of which was my great-grandfather Pearlie, made their way to California. Their way paid by Nancy from money she earned growing and selling fruit, mending clothes, and cooking for the local miners. Nancy, her descendants, Pearlie, and my grandmother purchased some 400 acres of land in Coloma, California. Close to 300 acres of that land was seized over the course of 10 years by the state of California under eminent domain proceedings to build a state park. The land wherein Marshall Gold Discovery Park sits was primarily owned by 3 Black land-owning families, one of which is mine, the Gooch Monroes. Just compensation was never given to any of these families, and we were denied the financial security and wealth associated with land ownership. Harmed beyond repair, Hurley spent the rest of his life mourning this loss. I also want to tell you about my maternal fourth great-grandmother, Pleasant Brent. Born enslaved in Kentucky in 1845, Pleasant's daughter, Lavinia, born into chattel slavery as well, would fight to right the wrongs perpetuated by those who enslaved Black America. In the late 1800s, she is one of many to petition Congress for compensation for their years of enslavement and for Congress to draft laws to better their condition. Although unsuccessful, this effort was one of the earlier attempts to right the wrongs of slavery and secure reparations. Pleasant, her daughter Lavinia, and grandchildren made their way to California in 1909. Their move was preceded by Pleasant's brother Henry arriving in California in 1870. Henry purchased a significant amount of land in what is now Midtown Sacramento, land encompassing M&N Street, bounded by 24th and 26th. By 1900, he would purchase additional parcels and homes throughout Sacramento. Henry died in 1912, and upon his death, his property, including the land purchases, were auctioned by the state under the pretense that he had no living heirs nor descendants, although his sister, my fourth great-grandmother, was alive and well. Pleasant contested the proceedings, but her efforts were futile, and that land and property that were rightfully hers was taken. The stories I have shared are just two of hundreds of thousands. There are too many families here in California and across the United States to count, with stories similar to mine. It's profoundly evident that descendants of chattel slavery, those living through Jim Crow, and institutionalized racism continue to be harmed, denied the same rights, freedoms, financial independence, and wealth of that of white America. This country was built on racist principles, ingrained in its moral fiber, and today complacency has normalized racism, widening the wealth gap between Black and white American families. With the institution of slavery setting the stage, we cannot deny the discriminatory practices that continue, magnifying disparities that directly affect our Black communities. Federal policies that do not correct and are rooted in racial practices continue to preserve the health, employment, housing, educational, and wealth inequities that directly harm Black America.
Okay, Dawn, you can take a moment to yourself and begin to proceed whenever you feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I was also asked, what does reparations look like? Making amends. There's so much. And I almost feel guilty for feeling the pain that I feel. But it's real. It resonates with me. This is my family. These are the stories that have been told and retold. And it hurts. And how do you fix that? You know, how do you right a wrong that is so systemic? And I don't know. I think we can start by eliminating the wealth gap, you know, however that looks, what we need to do, direct cash payments, just compensation for land that was stolen, education, educational resources, capital acquisition, access to wealth. You know, we've been denied this for so long. It's time to make a change. And I think there's enough people that know that we need to push this as far as we can go. And there has to be some repair. There has to be reparations. You know, I don't know where to begin. I'm sorry, I'm getting too emotional. But yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Bassiano, for your moving testimony. I think I can speak on behalf of the task force members and say that we appreciate what you imparted to us and to the members of the public. Now, I would like to turn to Secretary Weber for her expert testimony. Secretary Weber, you may begin with your expert testimony when you are ready. Thank you.
Mike.
We can't hear you.
We still can't hear you. Maybe try your volume.
Yeah.
Try your volume.
We still can't hear.
We are trying to work with Dr. Weber and her staff, and hopefully her technical difficulties will be overcome soon.
I'm wondering if in the meantime we should ask questions to the witnesses.
We can do that. I have a question for Ms. Bassiano, and it's a question that, if folks have observed, I've asked everyone who has provided personal testimony, what would an ideal reparations package look like for you and families similarly situated as yours?
Specific to my family, I guess. You know, if there's opportunity to return land, do it, or just compensation. But broader, We're looking at laws that have been in place for decades that specifically target the Black community, repealing of those laws. I think direct cash payments should be made as well, but we're looking at an educational piece, ensuring that, if an individual wants to go to college, they can, it'll be paid for, low interest loans, looking at the ability to not only secure wealth, but to keep it, ideally, I don't know, starting with direct cash payments.
Thank you, Ms. Bassiano. So I see that Secretary of State Shirley Weber has joined us. So Secretary of Weber, we're looking forward to hearing your expert testimony, and you may proceed with your testimony when you're ready. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
You can. Okay. I'm not sure what happened. I've been on for a long time. Evidently something went wrong. I want to thank you for your patience as we try to do this. And as I said, I appreciate the comments of the sister who spoke before me, and her story is familiar to many of us, and the pain is real. And I think when we all reflect on it, we try not to reflect that often on it because it is so extremely painful. I've been asked to just generally talk about, some have asked me to talk about my encounter in California and the kinds of things that I think are extremely important and influence where all of us are. Over the years, I've tried to figure out my family. And when I say figure it out, not so much the details of who's in the family and who's not in the family, but sometimes to try to understand some of the issues that exist and the pain that people feel and the limitations that folks have had over the years. I ran upon a reality that concerning, obviously my father was a sharecropper and worked in Hope, Arkansas, and had to leave the South because his life was threatened because he was demanding some sense of equity and fairness in Arkansas. And I've often wondered about his father that I knew as a child, who was always sometimes very mean and very much of a disciplinarian, always very fearful of white people. And I never could understand that as a kid. I couldn't understand it. Now, obviously, his sons that he had eventually all left Arkansas because of the harshness sometimes of his father that was in relationship to what was happening with the power structure in Arkansas. As a historian for 40 years working at the university, I came upon a number of discussions because I did my work in Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and knew much about the riots of the Red Summers of 1919 and what have you. And oftentimes those summers are focused upon, St. Louis and Chicago and those kinds of places. But seldom does it go as deep as down into Arkansas. And so I had a chance to really look into some things in Arkansas and ran across Elaine, Arkansas, and discovered that in 1919, Elaine, Arkansas had the worst race riot of any state in the nation. It was considered the deadliest race riot in the United States, deadlier than what happened in Oklahoma and all the other places. And it's interesting that has never really been, it's now being researched and looked at, but I had to begin to ask myself what impact probably did the race riots of 1919 have on my grandfather, not far from that in Arkansas. Because in that race riot, not only did the incident occur for that moment, but it went from about a month of people really tracking people down in the fields and the cotton fields and the various other areas and basically murdering them. And hundreds of African Americans were murdered during that time to strike a sense of fear in those who were in Elaine, Arkansas. And many people ran and went various other places. But the word of what happened in Elaine was a chilling effect across Arkansas. My father was born in 1918, the year before that, and he had several brothers and sisters before him. So obviously his father, who had been a sharecropper in Arkansas for many years, and his grandfather, who had been enslaved in Arkansas, Oliver Nash, saw the impact of Elaine, Arkansas, and it created tremendous amount of fear and deference that you just can't rise up, you can't raise those issues, you just can't do those things because the consequences, not only for that person, but for their entire family could be devastating. And they understood the viciousness of Jim Crow. And so when my father, obviously in 1951, decided to challenge what was happening at the way stations. It was very reminiscent of what had happened in Elaine, Arkansas. In Elaine, Arkansas, they were trying to organize the sharecroppers to get better wages for what was happening and fairer weights for themselves at the way station. Because the current system was you could pretty much, if you were a shareholder, if you were a landowner and had people sharecropping for you, you could basically charge them anything you want. You could weigh it and you could basically cheat them out of their weights, which is what often happened. And people knew how hard they worked from year to year and end up with less money every year. And so this was the issue that my father was raising and confronting those whites at the way station. And obviously, everyone talked about the fact that it sent chills throughout Hope, Arkansas, because of the fear that would happen to not only him, but eventually his family and others. It was in that spirit and in that concern that obviously my father fled Arkansas, had to be taken out of Arkansas in the middle of the night, put in a bed of a wagon, taken to a train station in Texarkana, and then sent to my grandmother, my mother's mother, who had left Arkansas some years before, to California. So my father came here with a tremendous amount of obviously bitterness and anger towards the South in terms of what it had done to him, but more committed and determined to make sure that it did not happen to his children. Consequently, my father never allowed us to say yes, sir, no, sir, ever. And even to this day, it is difficult for me to say yes, sir, no, sir. I never say it. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. My dad said, if yes and no is not good enough, then nothing is good enough. And he refused to allow any of his children to ever say those words. And it's interesting because I wonder if we actually came from the South, particularly my older brothers and sisters who were 11 and 12 years old when they came to California, never had a sense of deference of yes, sir, no, sir, ever. Even to this day, and they're 80 years old, they've never actually said those words because that was a curse to my father to be able to do that, a sense of disrespect to you as a person. So my father had this kind of radical spirit about him. And some people asked if I didn't inherit that, and I'm sure we all did inherit some of that from my father. But it became real clear that he saw California as an opportunity. And so like so many Californians who came here, they came to California because California became the promised land. It was different than the South. And initially they thought it was better. And it was in one sense. It was better to the extent like most African Americans who went to the North, when you study the migration into the North of the country, and you look at the books that you study them in Marcus Garvey's era and what have you, people saw the difference that existed in the North and the South. And mostly what the difference it was is that you didn't have to live 24 hours a day under the same area or the same roof as someone white, that you had some flexibility. You could basically do what you wanted when you got off from work in the evening. You didn't have to have massa making you come to his house to serve his children, or him knocking on your door in the middle of the night to come do something for him because one of his children was ill. You didn't have to have that 24-hour oversight as you had when you lived out in the country, that they could come to your house any time of day or night and make demands on you. When you lived in the city, you basically had your own neighborhoods, your own communities, and people were less likely to do that. Now, the police may come knocking on your door at night, but at least you didn't have the idea that the guy that you work for in whatever factory or whatever place you work was going to actually come into your neighborhood, make demands on your time and your space. And so in some sense, African Americans saw this as a sense of at least freedom with regards to their ability to have something in their own community. And as a result, they saw it as a better life. Now, clearly it was a better life, but it wasn't necessarily the same life as those who were white living in those communities. They didn't have the same level of opportunity. They didn't have the same kinds of things that they had. And even though they didn't have to deal with the signs of black and white signs in terms of the de jure racism, we had to deal with de facto. The fact that the structure of the society was of such that it did that. And so in California, de facto segregation and discrimination was as insidious as really de jure. It was sometimes more difficult for people to talk about it, to quantify, but surely it had elements of it that basically disempowered communities, and the way in which our communities were structured took away some of the things that we would normally have had. We talk about the fact that school segregation existed in California. And people thought it didn't initially because they only looked at the fact that they didn't have a sign, that there wasn't a law that said you couldn't. But there were things that were done even down to the Melendez lawsuit that basically happened 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education, that really talked about how Latino children were treated in schools and how African American children were treated in schools. And so what you had was a housing pattern and a gerrymandering of housing patterns that allowed school districts to create for themselves these segregated schools. And so those of us, myself included, who went to schools in California, who went to California schools, found ourselves in segregated schools, living in segregated housing projects. I lived in the Pueblos. The Pueblos had just opened as an opportunity. We lived in the Pueblos, and it was, when you compare it to the fact that we lived in a 2-room shanty in Hope, Arkansas, and then moved to a small place in the Trinity Elementary School area, moving to the Pueblos into the projects where you have a house with 4 bedrooms and you got 8 kids, 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom standard, and some space to breathe, some grass, some areas to run and to play and what have you. It looks like a great place to be because of that. But what it did do, obviously, is totally segregate that Black population away from everyone else. The big red track that ran on the track near Long Beach and 52nd Street basically kept that community encapsulated there. And as a result, growing up in Los Angeles, you have the experience of being in a very closed, not close, but closed community where your school was all Black. I went to all Black elementary school. My neighborhood was all Black. There were no one there but Black people. Latinos lived in East LA. We lived in South Central LA, very south, as well as in Watts. And so as a result, those communities, those neighborhoods could be easily isolated with limited resources and limited opportunity. When I was in elementary school in the 50s, no one could teach in those schools other than Black people. They did not allow Blacks to teach anywhere other than in those particular schools. And so for me as a kid growing up, I saw nothing but, I saw Black teachers, I saw Black administrators. Well, I didn't see Black administrators. The principals were still all white. But I saw all of the folks that are in my community. It was a closed community that was basically all white in terms of teachers, students in the lower grades. When you got to middle school, you saw a couple of more individuals who were white. And by the time you got to high school, you saw a balance somewhat of Black and white teachers that were there. But the housing patterns were clear. That was clear in terms of where people lived. And the impact, of course, is that you end up having these communities that are basically all Black. Eventually, if you move out of those communities, you will find yourselves in a community that is integrated for a minute, and then it becomes all Black. Because when we moved out of the projects and moved over to 45th Street and between Broadway and Grand, there was probably 3 white people on the block, and probably before we knew it, there was everybody on the block was Black. That they had all their children, their grandchildren had moved them out. And as a result, we end up basically with those things, the reality. California had covenants on many of their deeds that didn't allow you to sell them to African Americans. And those covenants now still exist, but they are you can no longer enforce them. And so what happens is that when you have this segregation, as in my school, you end up with a school that you can control the curriculum, you can control what people become, you can basically decide that the school has a large technical education program, very small programs that take people to college, very few counselors that take them to college, and basically people become technical individuals who become trained to do things. So the wood shop, metal shop, and those shops were probably the biggest thing in auto shops, were the biggest programs at Manual Arts High School at that time. The smallest programs had to do with college preparation. And it's interesting that college prep only became a major issue and a concern when we had the influx of immigrants from China in the 60s. When the political dynamics changed in China, we basically saw that the school curriculum began to accommodate the interest of the Chinese in higher education, or more importantly, the racism of the school board that they believed Chinese folks were smarter, even though they hadn't even been tested. And so these were the kinds of realities that you dealt with. When I graduated from Manual Arts High School, they used to have summer and winter classes. And so The summer class had 600 graduates, over 600 graduates. Of the 600 graduates, there were only about 10 of us in the college prep classes, 10 African Americans. The rest of the class was filled with Chinese immigrants, Chinese and Japanese immigrants. And the whole school, in the class of the 600, there were only 5 white people in the whole class. One of their fathers was from a professor at SC, and the rest of them happened to be immigrants who came in and who lived from Russia and other places, who lived in the Black community and sent their children to that school. But pretty much the white flight was common in the community. There were basically schools that, like I said, that were all Black and with very little accommodation for others that were there. And only at some point, it was interesting to me that when our communities, basically, people would we be there for a minute, we see the flight, we see people leaving. And the institutions that could not fly away, who could not get away, figured out ways to limit the impact of Black people. And I think of I talk about it not because I'm from UCLA, but I think about SC and SC being trapped in the Black community at that time. It had built its institution there. It had meetings about moving SC out of South Central LA, but that was entirely too expensive because they had built some major buildings and facilities there. And so what happened, of course, as a result of community planning, you increase your visibility on the south side with the parks and the exposition park and so forth and so on. So you pretty much block people's ability to come in from there. You build some houses on the west side that were student housing, low income housing, some other housing over there that's new. You take the south side and you put some kind of marketplace down there that buffers SC. And the only other thing is right at the freeway, you put a hotel and you put the freeway right there. So the SC then becomes completely surrounded by other levels of development that really are not the same level of development that happens in the rest of the community in South Central LA. And so we saw this regularly, as a way to say that, this community may change, but there's certain things that will remain the same. When we talk about the voting population in Los Angeles, in terms of how people were voted and divided, we continue to recognize the fact, as the prior speaker did, that there were a number of things that limited voting. And we, those of us who are in the Assembly, as Mr. Bradford and Mr. Jones Sawyer here, have spent the last probably 8 years making sure that we change some of the dynamics of the process of voting, because even though California was much more liberal in its voting, it did very little to inform people about it. When I ran for the Assembly, I had people who didn't know that if you were an ex-felon, you could vote in California. They thought an ex-felon was just like somebody in Mississippi and Florida and other places. You could not vote. In California, they could. Even those in Sacramento who were, as I ran across so many of the lobbyists and the lawyers, many of them did not know that you could vote as an ex-felon in California. It really shocked me when I presented a bill that made it required that they basically give information to folks who had finished their term that they had the right to vote. And of course, many of our prisons and individuals who didn't want to do it said it was too difficult to basically do that, and it was too expensive to simply say to a person who was leaving prison, you can now vote. They said it would require millions and millions of dollars to change all of their materials just to put this one line in that says you can now vote. So there was tremendous amount of resistance to doing that, even though that had been California law. We just removed the last piece, which is about the ex-felons, that those who are basically on parole can now vote in California. And we had that for many, many years, those that could not. And so this is a new thing that has happened. And in our office, we sent, I think, 40 or 50,000 letters to people on parole who've been on parole for years, say you can now vote. Many of them had no idea that as a result of Prop 17, that they could vote. We sent that out. Some of them are ecstatic, finally got their ballots, and now are ready to vote. And we see, of course, that what has happened as a result of that is that this whole interest in voting among those who are in California and other places, we see, as pointed out, the number of bills that are now coming forward that are really working to keep people from voting in other states. Now, those bills don't come forward in California because California is a large Democratic population in its Assembly and its Senate. However, right now, there is a proposition to be placed on the ballot to now talk about ID voting and requiring people to have an ID in order to be able to vote. And we know that that's one of the new terms that's being used. It's a Jim Crow law, pretty much like literacy test and everything else, that will limit the number of persons who even attempt to register to vote. And clearly it will limit those who show up at the polls to vote if they have to have certain levels of ID that some of them may or may not have, particularly those who are older and who don't have birth certificates, who don't have those things, but have other forms of identification that would allow them to be able to participate in the process. So we are constantly dealing with the fact that this whole issue of voting opportunity, California's redlining of things, has been a part of California's legacy, despite the fact that we have always kind of prided ourselves in being a little bit further along than others. If any of you have not, you should get a chance to see the movie, The Bankers, because it's a true story about how these gentlemen, two men, owned about a third of all of Los Angeles downtown, and how they lost that property through some manipulations and things that happened in courts and some things that were in Texas, and it's called The Bankers. And it was interesting to me when I looked at the movie, because when I looked at the movie, I recognized the two men who had actually been at the end of the movie that had actually been the bankers. They were men that I saw regularly in the Southwest Wave, the black newspaper in Los Angeles when I was a kid. And these were men in the 60s who actually owned a significant number of pieces of property in downtown LA, and they're called the bankers. But it also talks about all of the covenants and the things that occurred that prevented Black people from owning property, not only downtown, but owning property in the west portion of Los Angeles, what they now call the jungle and all those places. All those things were restricted from being used for their ownership. And the only way they could get it was to buy it through someone white, which made them vulnerable to be cheated by the man's wife when he died, in terms of, because they couldn't write the documents, they couldn't create the laws that, or the documents that would give them the opportunity. So when we began to look at this, I mean, those of us who lived in Los Angeles, we always think of ourselves as being much more fortunate, and we were, than maybe some folks in the South somewhat. But the reality is the impact of the segregation, the impact of de facto laws, the fact that in fact there was ongoing discrimination. The fact that when I went to UCLA in the 60s, before, we looked up and there was 30-some thousand students at UCLA and only 300 Black students, and all of them, they were either and that included undergraduate, graduate, and graduate. I knew only probably the whole time I was at UCLA 3 Black professors in the whole, and that was through 3 degrees. 3 professors that were Black at UCLA. You see this and a slow evolution, the slow churn, and we see some more faces coming, but we see now a decline in the number of persons who are at those institutions. It is clearly a continuing struggle in California, I think, to live up to what it perceives itself to be as this wonderful dream that has equal opportunity and access for all. This commission has an opportunity to address those issues, hopefully to provide some permanent solutions so that we don't find ourselves in another 50 years from now having a conversation about reparations. Thank you so very much for inviting me to be with you.
Thank you, Secretary Weber, for providing that excellent expert testimony. It is 3 o'clock, or 3:02 to be exact, so we have 28 minutes left on this agenda item. So now I'd like to turn to task force members in the event that they would like to pose questions and comments to those providing expert and personal testimony. Again, the Blue Jeans technology does not allow me to see everyone on the screen. So in the event that you would like to ask a question, feel free to speak up or use